Welcome, everybody, to FashMash Pioneers, the monthly speaker series where Rachel and Arthur and I bring you the brightest minds shaping the future of fashion. For those new here today, we founded FashMash 9 years ago with a core business mission that remains just as relevant today, to encourage open dialogue and sharing of ideas to drive the industry forward. This is our very first FashMash Pioneers discussion of 2021, and I could not think of a better pioneer with whom to begin. Baroness Lola Young of Hornsey has been on our wish list for as long as I can remember, and I am so delighted that Rachel Arthur will be interviewing her this evening. She is one of the most renowned voices in the space of modern slavery, having played a pivotal role in ensuring the Modern Slavery Act was passed in the UK in 2015, as well as its subsequent amendment in 2020. She has also pioneered for change within the fashion sector specifically, leading the All Party Parliamentary Group on ethics and sustainability in fashion. Before we delve any deeper, I wanted to say a big thank you to our sponsor this evening, Klaviyo. I'm delighted to say they are on board for another year, and it really wouldn't be possible without them. They are an e-commerce marketing platform for brands of all types and sizes, from 111 Skin to Hummingbird Bakery, and of course, FashMash. We transferred our email marketing to them last year, and their customer service, the insights that they can provide, and the really targeted performance-based marketing is just invaluable for us. If you would like to give them a go, and we highly recommend it, go to klaviyo.com/fashmash for your free trial. Right then, some context. It's worth saying from the get-go, slavery is a term that the consumer might feel is completely at odds with the superficial glamour of the fashion industry. But Rana Plaza's collapse in 2013 brought it to the front of everybody's mind. It made the world sit up and finally listen. More recently, think of the expose in the Sunday Times last summer of Leicester's garment factories and the exploitation that they were providing on, that they were enforcing on our very doorsteps. This is all while profits soar and the big cats get richer at these brands. This is an industry with a chasm of pay like no other. In Bangladesh, a garment worker might be paid just £73 a month, and that is the legal wage there. Meanwhile, in Leicester, like I said, on our very doorstep in the UK, we're talking £3 an hour. And this is all while the owners of Inditex and LVMH feature in the top 100 rich list of billionaires globally. There has been activism to highlight the environmental issues within sustainability, but generally consumers are less aware of the social side of sustainability, even when it's happening right here in the UK. So where do human rights and social justice come into the bigger conversation of how we can sustainably change this industry, especially in light of all the repercussions of COVID-19? There's no better pioneer than the Baroness to answer that. She started out in acting before becoming a professor of cultural studies, a writer, a broadcaster, and a cultural critic. She was head of culture at the Greater London Authority before being appointed an independent crossbench member of the House of Lords in 2004. She used this platform to address racial disproportionality in the criminal justice system and the vulnerability of women and girls at risk, and served on select committees on sexual violence in conflict and on the EU. She was recently appointed Chancellor of the University of Nottingham. What a biography. I meant it when I said there really is no better woman with whom we could kick off this, our third year of FashMash Pioneers. Finally, I wanted to tell you a little more about the charity we are supporting this year. Since the pandemic, we are no longer charging for tickets to our talks, but instead asking for donations to a charity of the speaker's choice. This evening, the Baroness has chosen Anti-Slavery International, a charity that has been around for over 180 years. But their work is by no means done. There are still 40 million people who are involved in modern slavery today and entrapped within it. It really is a crucial charity, and their goal to provide freedom for all could not be more relevant than now. So please do donate if you have not already done so. We will keep the donation link live within the Eventbrite link that you all received. Some notices. Please do ask questions via the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. You can also join the conversation with the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, or of course on social media. We are at FashMash on Instagram, and there's the hashtag FashMash. So without further ado, it's time to welcome Rachel and Lola. I'm so excited for this conversation this evening. I feel like the social aspect of sustainability is just not addressed enough, and modern slavery really, as I've just mentioned, it could not be more relevant than it is today. So Rachel, Lola, please join the conversation. If you could turn on your videos and take yourselves off mute.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rosanna. That was the most amazing introduction. And Lola, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening on yet another Zoom call. I'm sure your day has been absolutely full of them.
My pleasure. And thank you very much for inviting me. And I just want to start off with an apology in advance, because even in that introduction, somehow my internet connection just dropped and took me out of the space and then rejoined. So if that happens, it's not because I've run away because of your fierce questioning. It's because my internet connection is pretty poor today for some reason.
Well, we will keep our fingers crossed, and worst case scenario, if we need to move to just audio, I'm sure everyone will perfectly understand. So thank you for giving us the heads up on that. So listen, let's jump straight in. Our title tonight is Tackling Modern Slavery in Fashion. And as Rosanna mentioned, as a member of the House of Lords, you were central to getting this act passed in the UK in 2015 and further amended in 2020. But I wanted to maybe start right with the obvious. How do we actually define modern slavery?
Obvious and quite contentious, that question,
I'm sure.
Actually. Yeah, because I mean, you know, I guess a lot of people initially, when that term was around, started to say, well, hold on a minute, we abolished slavery, you know, 200 and odd years ago. And then there'll be some people who say, well, wait a minute, what goes on in terms of exploitation and abusive labor isn't the same as chattel slavery. You know, so what we've got today in this term, modern slavery, encapsulates a huge range of activity. And I do think it is slightly problematic, but maybe we'll come on to that. But I don't think that not having a great definition should stop us from trying to combat what is going on. So essentially, Absolutely. If you look at something that is really awful, where people, I think it was Rosanna mentioned Rana Plaza, you know, where people literally die as a result of these kinds of abusive labor practices. That is at one end, if you like. So there's a whole spectrum of activity that will go to maybe something that people would see as relatively minor, but in fact is quite important to the people who are involved in it. So, you know, when we were talking about earlier about Leicester, for example, that's people not being paid properly, made to work extra long hours, feeling very insecure, potentially having their papers taken away by the factory owners and so on and so forth. So it's a wide spectrum of activity we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think we'll come on to quite a few of those examples, as you've mentioned. But one of the things I find really interesting, as Rosanna said at the beginning, you know, there are estimated to be about 40 million people who are in modern slavery worldwide right now. And as you said, in various versions of what that actually means. But one thing we do know is that there's a lot of that within the fashion industry or within the fashion supply chain. What I find really fascinating about that is that this feels like a really big topic in this sector currently, especially with everything that this past year has brought around sort of awareness of garment workers and their plight, obviously currently happening with the pandemic. but its presence has not exactly been a secret before for those in the industry. So I'm interested as to why you think it's taken so long for it to start changing. And do you think it is actually changing now?
Yeah, well, if I can answer the second point first, I think it is beginning to change for a whole heap of reasons. And you'll have to forgive me because I'm the kind of person who likes to say everything is complex, because it usually is. So to try and interweave all these different strands. So one of the reasons why I do think it has to change is because wider society is beginning to change its attitude and its level of tolerance for these kind of behaviors in business. And that affects the price of shares, it affects the way that investors are thinking, and so on and so forth. So we used to talk a lot about corporate social responsibility. That's shifted somewhat to environmental sustainability and governance. And it's a different way of thinking about it, but much more, in my view, it's much more effective potentially, because it says this is something that runs throughout the whole organization. When you include governance, that's about the boards of directors. And I think in the past, what's happened is that there've been some very diligent people working in these companies. Some of them will be sales staff, some of them will be in back office, some of them will be in corporate social responsibility, who've tried to make their voices heard, and they've not been heard by those in the boardroom who constantly got their eye on the financial bottom line. So that's what I think things are changing. And I think you're absolutely right when you say that in the past, and I think still to a large extent today, it's as if businesses, and again in the fashion world, have been able to take on board the environmental sustainability piece, because in a sense, that's kind of easy. Do nothing, we're extinct. You know, that's kind of like a simple equation. But with this whole area of the social and the social impact of companies, and especially fashion companies, that's much more difficult and complex to deal with, because it goes to the fundamental heart of what a business is for. Why are you here? Why do you produce nice clothes? Which I like as much as anybody, right? And we like to have fun and that frivolity, and also think seriously about all of that stuff. It's great, fashion, potentially. But do we really think that, you know, the world would stop if we stopped with fashion, particularly in its present incarnation? No, of course it wouldn't. But so by the same token, it's not good enough simply to say, do no harm. We have to go further than that and say, what is it that you're contributing to society, to people? And that's what I think fashion companies, as indeed other companies, find quite difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting there that you brought up the governance piece and this idea that really we all have a responsibility attached to it as well. And obviously in this case, particularly businesses. And in that sense, I wanted to go back to talking about Leicester and obviously the scandal that happened around Boohoo, you know, this idea, obviously the Sunday Times investigation that exposed those Leicester factories as being attached or otherwise to Boohoo. And of course, that was super controversial. And I think one of the things that was interesting was obviously the piece about the obviously the very low wages that were happening there, but also the simple fact that, and I think the reason people really paid attention to it was the fact that these workers were being forced to do so during lockdown when the rest of us were obviously staying at home. And I think, you know, that's very interesting in of itself, as you said, as different variations of what we mean by modern slavery, to think that actually it's that sort of enforcement really in many ways, when obviously the rest of society is abiding by different rules. But without us going to the ins and outs of everything that really followed there, you know, all of the pieces around whether they were supposedly aware or not aware, and obviously the various further investigations and reports that followed. The one thing that this has really raised, I think, more than anything else, again, as it did back with Rana Plaza, of course, in 2013, is once again the need for brands to be more aware of what is happening in their own supply chain, which of course relates to that governance piece. And we have obviously seen the same in Xinjiang in China with the forced labor camps. So from your perspective, I'm really interested to hear, like, how do we ensure that businesses are facing up to these responsibilities throughout their supply chains and not obviously just in their immediate vicinity? Because there is still a significant lack of transparency there, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And just, I know you said you didn't want to go into detail about the Leicester thing. Let's be clear. I've known about that what was going on there for 10 years, and so
yeah,
have other people.
that was the example I meant.
yeah, and then there are similar things that happen in Manchester, in London, and so on. So because everybody likes to think it's somewhere else rather than on their doorstep, and so I want to be clear about that. No, but I mean, this again is one of the key issues. How do activists, how do politicians, how do consumers position fashion brands in such a way that they feel that they can't escape doing something about these issues? And it's not good enough. In law, if you drive into a lamppost after having a few drinks, you can't say, oh, I didn't realize you weren't supposed to knock down lampposts after you've been drinking and driving, because ignorance is no defense in the law. Yeah. So why should it be defense in business? Why should people be allowed to say, they should know what's going on in their supply chain. Now they will say, oh yes, but our supply chain is so hyperextended, it's so big, it goes all over the place, and how can we possibly keep track of everything? And I say, well, that's your problem, because you've created the business model that means you have to do that, that makes you think that's the way you have to operate. So if that's not working, it's because the business model is wrong, not because you're some sort of innocent bystander to what's happening in your supply chain. And I think more of us have got to be more vocal and pushing back on that. But having said that, I think there's some great organisations that do that kind of work, like Clean Clothes Campaign, Labour Behind the Label, and so on, who constantly pushing away at this. And as I say, I do think the tide is beginning to turn.
Yeah, we've seen some amazing work from those sorts of businesses, and Remake and the Pay Up campaign, haven't we, over this past year? It's really been phenomenal, which actually, raises another point there. I mean, COVID has obviously made garment workers' lives around the world so much worse, because of obviously the cancelling of orders. Is there more risk of modern slavery happening alongside as a result right now, do you think?
Yeah, all the reports, and when I say reports, I don't just mean written reports, I mean verbal reports from people from, the Southern Hemisphere, who are basically the people who are most impacted by this cancellation of orders, is that it's made things a whole lot worse. And the thing is, it has a knock-on effect, right? So as horrible as it is to say, well, these people may have been working under exploitative conditions anyway, but without those, and this isn't an argument for saying we should keep it up no matter, but without those, families are forced into poverty. So what do? Well, some of them, so children have to come out of school because they have to find work in order to, sustain the family. So in the developing world, the impact of COVID-19 in health terms is probably, well, that again is quite complicated, but obviously there's an impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic in those countries too. But in addition to that, you've got underlying poverty and deprivation. And then on top of that, you've got exploitation by Western European mainly and American companies. And then on top of that, your strategy for getting out of that awful conundrum may involve having to put your child into a child labour situation. So it's exacerbating, making much, much worse this whole area around modern slavery. And those are some of the estimates. And the other thing to say is that some of this forced labour and exploitative activity does come from criminal activity. And criminals, or people who are sort of little bit dodgy, are always very quick. They're always very quick to get in there and exploit a particular situation. And of course, that's what they've been doing.
Because they can see gains, benefits for themselves out of it, I suppose, which is ultimately always what it's about, isn't it? Everybody out for themselves, which, does obviously lead to huge exploitation. This might take us down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but is one of the solutions that we see something like living wage being enforced on a global scale? Could that ever be a reality?
Well, I think, some of the fashion companies will tell you that they do apply the living wage within the particular region that they're in. And of course, the living wage in Bangladesh will be incredibly different to the living wage in London. I mean, that's obviously the case. I think worldwide, I'm not quite sure how that would work and whether we could make something like that work, because again, it is a multi-layered thing. To me, the big thing is, if you if you want to support people in the so-called developing world, you don't do it by exploiting them and abusing their need to work for incredibly low wages. You know, you don't take advantage of that. To me, if you can't think about those people in a similar way to you, if you can't think, I have a 10-year-old child, and yeah, I'd be quite happy for them to go down a mine and dig out the cadmium so I can have a nice iPhone, or, you know, make some cheap clothes for me because I don't want to pay too much, or whatever. You know, you can't be thinking like that. And this is what we're calling upon businesses, you know, to stop thinking in a way that somehow it's all right because these things happen over there somewhere to people who are, you know, brown or black or whatever. You know, it's not on at all. So in terms of making that change, it is a huge amount of work, particularly if we don't want it to be a kind of superficial tick boxing exercise, which unfortunately some of the statements around modern slavery have become that really for some companies. Yeah.
It's really interesting that you say that, though, because I can relate so much to that. You know, we talk about it all the time, this idea that it's, you know, it's at arm's length, it's not us, it's in other places, it doesn't affect us. We see that with the climate crisis, full stop. You know, it's something that we think isn't going to really impact us. Of course, there was really interesting reports over the last couple of days around how it is impacting in the UK already on the climate side of things. But on, you know, on the Leicester side of things, that was on our doorstep. You know, it was right here. And I think a lot of us in the industry particularly thought, you know, maybe this is our moment, when actually the consumer as well, or the citizen, sits up and pays attention to the fact that they shouldn't be buying from somebody like Boohoo because this is the way it treats its workers. You know, and actually what we saw, and I've got some of the numbers here, Boohoo's sales jumped 40% in the latter part of last year. And we know that the share price has done really, really well as well, despite everything that went on, and obviously it dipping initially. It seems like it didn't really impact the customer whatsoever as a result. Why do you think that is? Because it's incredibly depressing to think, even when it's on our own ground, that we can't associate with it being somebody, you know, as you say, human, your own relation. You wouldn't want them to be treated that way.
I'm afraid, it is depressing, because it's kind of like, you think, it's not as if there aren't other suppliers of cheap clothing to choose from as well, that don't have such a disreputable, such a bad reputation. And I suppose, I mean, there's all kinds of ways that psychologically I could think that people want to make themselves feel good. You know, we're having it's so difficult for so many people being stuck indoors and all the rest of it, and so on and so forth. And when, you know, if somebody is selling something I believe that there was another example, wasn't there? I can't remember the name of the company, but they were selling something, a garment for £1 or £3 in their sale, and people kind of rush. So you sort of think, oh, you know, maybe just to treat myself or whatever. But the sad thing is, I mean, this is going to sound really, really brutal, but actually the only reason Rana Plaza hit our consciousness, in my view, is because over 1,000 people died, right? Because before Rana Plaza, as you probably know, there'd been any number of fires where hundreds of people had died for the same kinds of circumstances, you know, where people have been locked into factories making clothing for us, and fires broken out and the fire doors are locked, you know, and all those people have died. There'd been any number of those up until the moment of Rana Plaza, but it was so big. And, you know, this relates to news values, you know, the collapsing building and the debris and the weeping women, great news item, you know, so this could not help but permeate our consciousness. And, you know, of course, it gave birth to Fashion Revolution, which is another one of those fantastic organizations that does so much and punches above its weight in, you know, so many ways.
Constantly,
But, you know, at the end, absolutely. But at the end of the day, this is the sadness for me, is that people couldn't think beyond that, even to say, you know, no, why should anybody have to die in order to draw our attention to something that is wrong? You think about the Grenfell Tower as well, you know, and what's coming out the inquiry there, the business attitude to those, the cladding and so on. So it's like, unless there's a big tragedy, This is what people have somehow, I don't know whether they anesthetize themselves or can't bear to think about it, or what it is, but we're not really thinking this through in terms of what it means in a big picture. I mean, if I can just, I know I'm sort of going on a little bit, but it is something that I really feel quite strongly about. And the other thing that says to me, why do you think people are willing to sacrifice their lives in a tiny boat on the Channel or in the Mediterranean? It's not because they think, oh, I know, let's go out on a kind of suicide mission. It's because the poverty and the choices that they're facing in their homes are so awful that it's worth taking that chance. And so, but what if we could diminish the impact? What if we could diminish the amount of poverty in those places so that people didn't feel that they had to leave and put themselves in the way of harm, or put themselves in the way of traffickers? You know, that's the other thing. So it's all interconnected to me, and that's why I kind of try to tease out the complexities of this big problem that we have.
No, and I'm really glad that you raised that point around this sort of notion of really how interconnected everything is, because you very nicely segued to my next question. You know, just to sort of, I guess, set it up a little bit, you know, you started the All Party Parliamentary Group on Ethics and Sustainability in Fashion, which does, of course, bring in the environmental element of this whole discussion as well. But the two do, as you know, as we heard in the introduction, and we've talked a little bit about here, they are considered very much separately still within organisations, or certainly maybe in the sort of broader psyche, and they're coming closer together, I think, within those that work in the space. But I think the point that you just made there about poverty and about inequality is a really important one. And if I may, I'm actually just going to quote this really, really good analogy that I mentioned to you on our prep call, and I just think is so strong. So this was from a podcast about systemic inequality and racism from the Business of Fashion earlier this month. And during it, Doug Stevens, who plays the role of host, relayed this analogy. And he says, I'm just going to quote it. What I've discovered through the conversations in this series is that the topic of sustainability in fashion or retail specifically is a little like Russian nesting dolls. On the outside, you have the problem of global environmental decay. But lift the first doll off, however, and you discover the underlying condition of rampant economic inequality. Remove the inequality doll and you find the even more pernicious racism doll. Together, they form an organized system of resource extraction without a return of reciprocal value. The problem being, if we can't resolve the racism at the core, we can't fight economic inequality. And without income equality, we can't ever solve environmental decay. So, massive question to you, but how do we make justice central to all of these discussions? And I guess to just go in more depth of really your take on those interconnections, because it is really fascinating. And I'd have not heard that Russian doll analogy before, but it's a really powerful way of thinking about it.
It is very powerful, partly because it's visual. I mean, you see them kind of being lifted off with the kind of those labels on them. And, you know, and I have to say, I totally agree with that analysis. And again, coming back to this whole ESG agenda, which is growing and is gathering momentum. And in spite of, you know, some organizations' share prices not being affected by their activities, other investors are beginning to say, well, wait a minute, you know, we do not want to be involved in this kind of activity. And if you think about it, a lot of investors are institutional. So they're like trade unions, they're pensions funds. And who pays into those? Well, we do. So, you know, we do at a distance, yes, but we do have a voice. That interconnection is so important to me, because if you start to think about, even if you look at the history of slavery and enslavement, you know, and when I say history, I'm not going to go back to Greeks and Romans and Egyptians, although a historian can do that better than I can. But if we go back to the transatlantic slave trade, that's absolutely that model. You extract from the continents and you exploit it, and then you make loads of money out of it from the state and for the state and for individual companies. And you know this thing now whereby one would hope that everybody should know that it was the slave owners who got compensated after the ending of the slave trade. The slave owners got compensated, and we, the British public, stopped paying off that debt in 2015, just 6 years ago, right?
That's so crazy.
And then again, it is. And if you think about gold, if you think about cadmium, as I was saying earlier, the cobalt and all these minerals that are needed for our computers, where are they? They're in the southern hemisphere. And those people are also seen as expendable in a way. So we can take from them, and I'm saying we, because obviously, you know, I've got an iPad, an iPhone and all the rest of it. I wear clothes. You know, we're all part of that system. The issue is, can we dare to open our eyes to that, see how we're each of us implicated in that, and work out what each of us can do as individuals or joining together with others to try and turn that system on its head, or to throw out that system, so that you don't have this how can I put it, this pressing down. Oppression is a really good word, although it sounds a little bit 60s kind of, you know, hippy dippy lefty kind of thing, but it is oppressive to have to be in that situation where all that's happening is your country and your people are being plundered for their resources, and then used in a bad way, to put it simply, in these other countries, the rich countries, the richer populations, and then those people mess up the planet and expect the southern hemisphere people to pay for it as well. You know, so you can all of a sudden you can say, oh well, you know, climate change, global warming, I think you people in India and China and Africa really ought to put a curb on your pollution, development, etc., etc. So it's completely upside down. But I think, yes, that comment about the nesting dolls is a good one to use to try and explain to people how these things work. And I think one of the greatest failures of our education system, and I tell you, that is only going to get worse, given what I've heard about future plans for educating at all levels, the greatest problem is that it doesn't help us to join up those dots, to make the connections between those different things. And it's not about trying to make people feel bad about themselves or guilty, kind of complete waste of time. Don't bother feeling bad about yourself or the guilt of your forefathers or all that. It's about your responsibility here, now, today.
Yeah, and I'd love us to come on to that idea of individual actions, because I think it is really powerful to think about in the context of this conversation. But just before we do, just thinking about some of the things you've said there about inequality, and really about the way that it is sort of split between that global north and global south divide. Do you think there's a world where we change that system of just constantly feeding into the rich at the top? You know, the wealth divide's getting bigger and bigger. Obviously, there's been so much about that over the past year. All of these businesses that have really benefited so much from COVID in many ways. But
yeah,
you know, even when we're seeing the worst possible behavior occurring, and that, you know, those pockets of wealth are still expanding so much. Do you see a world where that could ever shift? And I guess specifically in fashion, maybe to ask you within our industry.
Sure. Well, I suppose, I mean, my short answer would be not in my lifetime. But, you know, but you're not struggling only, well, you know, only for your own kind of selfish gain. You know, one would hope that these things, and look, you know, I sort of think that you know, my sort of realist self says, look, here's what happened. Women got the vote in this country, you know, only just over 100 years ago. And it took all of that time to get women to vote. Black people of African descent and other abolitionists were able to end the transatlantic slave trade on British ships after 300 years. So that's not to say that we've got to wait hundreds and hundreds of years for these things to happen, but we have to recognize that sometimes these things are slow. So how can we fast track? How can we fast forward? How can we make some of these systems changes happen? And actually, fashion is quite a good example, because, you know, I've always said to people, look, fashion industry, the great thing about the fashion industry, it's one of the creative industries. People are creative, they're innovative, they want to do things differently, they want to challenge, they want to, I don't know, you know, provoke. and so on. So some of those things are happening. A lot of things are happening within the fashion industry, all the different kinds of business models that are springing up. And it may be that some of those ways of thinking, those ways of operating will filter upwards. It hasn't all got to be top down. Yeah. And certainly the large brands may not feel it's in their best interest to change their business models. You know, when I was a kid, there was this song we used to sing along to from some 50s musical. Oh my God! And it's who wants to be a millionaire? But I'm thinking today you'd have to, because that was like, oh my gosh, a millionaire in the 50s, a millionaire. And today you say, who wants to be a trillionaire?
Yeah, exactly.
Because actually, to be a millionaire, any old person can be a millionaire. You know, and virtually, you know, it looks like, oh, all these people are now becoming billionaires. When is Jeff Bezos going to be a trillionaire is the thing. And when you look at the inequitous nature of that degree of wealth, what does it mean? What does it say? And what is it for? What exactly is it for? How many cars can you drive at once? Houses can you live in at once? How many children can you have that do you think you've got to endow for the rest of their life? So it's like, you know, there is this thing of people saying, well, you know, you can't pay people more than the living wage because it, you know, hits our bottom line of profits. I say, excuse me, but you're earning tens of millions a year.
Exactly.
What are you talking
Still
about?
Relative.
Now, I'm not saying nobody should nobody should earn lots of money. I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is you've got to look at how you justify what you pay people and the kinds of conditions of work that you give to people that enable you to live this extraordinarily ridiculous lifestyle.
You come at everything you say with so much energy, and I can feel that you have so much passion for driving change in this space. But you know, and of course, as you mentioned at the beginning, we've seen momentum, but do you ever get downhearted at all with this constant fight and thinking, you know, how are we ever going to actually change it truly at a systemic level? And if not, how do you keep motivated?
Well, I think I have the odd moment, but that is usually reserved for politicians that I sort of feel are letting us down in so many ways.
I can't imagine.
Too many ways too. Yeah, you can't imagine. No, I have to sort of, well, I don't have to, but I will try and be a bit diplomatic. But no, I mean, no, because fundamentally, I think every time, actually, I sort of, it's even better when you're with people live, right? I think we've had a good rapport in spite of not having having spoken, you know, twice before, and somehow the Zoom has held up as well. But you know, I feel that in a room, you know, when I speak in a room and there are hundreds of people, or even 10 or 20 people, or even, you know, 15 fashion companies around a table, I can do that. I can get those chief executives from those companies to sit round a table with me, and I can say to them, okay, what are you going to do? You know, what are you going to do that's different? When you walk out this room, it's all very well sitting there saying you're going to do X, Y, and Z. When you walk out this room, what's going to be different when you go back to your workplace? And, you know, so there's so many of us, push. That's where I get my strength and energy from. The fact that you're doing what you do, the fact that other people, all of these things that are happening next week with International Women's Day, that's where the energy is. That's where the energy is, I think.
Yeah, no, that's such a positive way of looking at it. And I guess, you know, on that note then, as we sort of mentioned earlier, how, for, you know, people listening, most people that are listening obviously come from the industry. So I guess one side of the question is how people can contribute as insiders within the industry, but more broadly, you know, when we're looking at modern slavery specifically, how can we all contribute individually towards this change? Like, what could we all go and do to help?
Well, you know, I hate to be prescriptive, actually, even though I'm always telling people what to do. So a bit of a contradiction there. But I would also say that, you know, earlier I was talking about individual responsibility, but I would also say I always think in these instances, what are we asking people to do? I'm not going to say to somebody who's struggling to put food on their you know, on the plates for their children in one room during lockdown, stuck indoors all the time. I'm not going to say to them, you know, you really should be, you know, boycotting this or doing that or whatever. All the bottom, the absolute sort of minimum is that I ask people, try and think what these things, what is happening, and also to try and think through how your predicament relates to those other people, because that's where the connections are too. You know, we are here, you were there, you know, you're in a particular situation. If you're in a really difficult situation, what is it that's brought that about? It's not always about that individual being able to change their circumstances. So that's, as I say, the bottom thing is just to try and think that through, try and read as much as possible from reliable sources about these things that are going on. If you've got money, well, then you can do lots of things. You've got choices, and you can choose where you put your money to buy your clothes and shoes. And, you know, you should do that. And if you've got money, you've probably also got a little bit of spare time that you could use to do a little bit of research on that, actually, and find out where, you know, which are the companies that are really striving and genuinely striving to change, you know, their approach to fashion. And it's, by the way, it's not only about fast fashion. I think that's a bit of a misconception, because in a way it's easy to point the finger at the boohoos, the pretty little things and so on and so forth. But actually, you know, I always remember somebody doing a demonstration for me, taking out T-shirts from a case, like a traveling salesperson. And all of these T-shirts, you know, one was priced, I think, £2 or £3, and then going up in steps to, I think the top price one was £65, a very famous high-end designer T-shirt, all made in the same factory.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
So, you know, it's not like, so again, as I say, you know, if you've got the time and the money, do a bit of research, look out for where you spend your money. If you're inclined to do so, people will laugh when I say this, but I say, write to your MP and say, you know, that you're upset to think that in the new piece of legislation that's coming out, it'll make it easier for people not, for organisations and companies not to adhere to modern slavery act and so on. You know, we've got Twitter, we've got Instagram, we've got all of these different avenues through which we can say, do you know what, I don't feel comfortable about what's going on here. Does anybody know any more about this? And what can we do about it? So there are different ways. And what I would say, I know we've been talking about fashion, but actually this is not just about fashion. This is about everything from the minute you get up to the minute you go to bed, everything. Even the people who collect your rubbish in the street, outsourced, you know, by your local council. We don't even know what some of them are doing. And we know we've found examples of modern slavery in those kinds of settings too. So yeah, it's pervasive, and we just, sorry.
No, that's super interesting and so helpful, because I think it's really nice to have some very tangible and tactical things to think about. But given that you said about writing to MPs, and given your position, of course, in the House of Lords, from your perspective, do you think that ultimately what is needed, or what we will start to potentially see more of, is more in the way of regulation for this industry around all of this?
Well, I think, I mean, I always sort of say that if you don't self-regulate, then the government has to do it. So, you know, within the Modern Slavery Act, there was the section that asked companies to report on the due diligence around transparency in their supply chains. And frankly, a lot of those statements have been quite pathetic. And so the government has now listened. And again, you know, that's because other parliamentarians, people from the industry, there are good people in the fashion industry, right? There are good people who really, really want to do stuff. And so what they're saying is, if we want to be transparent about our supply chains and others aren't, who's got the advantage in the market? We're going to lose out, and we don't want to be losing out because we're doing the right thing. So government has to make an intervention there, and that's why the Modern Slavery Act is going to be strengthened. There's going to be more demands made of every company who's reporting under the Act. So these things can have an impact. And, you know, there are companies that I've spoken to and they will say, we've done what we've done because our customers keep telling us. They keep telling us that they don't want to have environmentally damaging clothing. And they keep telling us they don't want people to be exploited on their behalf. So tell these people.
Yeah, the customer voice ultimately is what they listen to, isn't it? So there's a lot to be said there about playing that role. I want to make sure that I leave time for questions, and I can see we've got loads coming in, but just one more from me. We always like to end on an optimistic and a positive note, although I have to say, despite the very, very important and big topic we've been talking about, this has been a very optimistic conversation, which is really great. But I just wanted to ask you, if you were to look ahead within all of this, what's your hope for the industry?
For the fashion industry? I hope that that the industry will, as a whole, I hope that more people, more organizations within the industry, and I'm thinking particularly at board level, will understand that it's untenable to exploit and abuse and, you know, support these practices within their supply chains, you know, in any way, shape or form. And that they understand that it's not just about looking at what they call the tier one suppliers. It's not just looking at the immediate suppliers. It's looking all the way down that line. Who picks the cotton, you know, for that cotton t-shirt? How does that get transported? Well, yeah. across the seas in containers, and shipping is another high risk area, you know, et cetera, so that those businesses eventually become what we've been talking about, which is agents for world benefit. So that when somebody says to you, what is your business for? You can say hand on heart, actually, we have a net contribution to society and to the world, rather than, and we also make enough financial profit for none of us to be, you know, sort of missing out, as it were. So, and I think that's possible. It's just a reorientation. It's a big reorientation for many, but eventually, because otherwise what I foresee happening, particularly around the environmental sustainability piece, is that it'll all be worth nothing, because we'll all be underneath what was a glacier or something.
Exactly.
You know, so.
No, and it is a huge shift, but I'm so glad you ended on that note, because I think, you know, that's the exact reason that all of us are here this evening, because we all do genuinely believe in that need for change. So huge thank you for your incredible insights tonight. And I'm going to invite Rosanna back, and we can open up the floor to questions. And I'm excited to see how many we've got in. Over to you, Rosanna.
Thank you so much, both of you. I was taking notes throughout, so many quotable comments and such insight. Thank you. There are lots of questions. I'm going to go through them all. I think a few of them we've covered within within Rachel's discussion, but let's see, I'm sure you could expand. So first of all, Anna Craig, she was our first question. She said, why do you think consumers turn a blind eye to this issue, even when they are paying ludicrously low prices for clothes?
I wish I was a psychologist and could tell you, but I do think, although that might sound a bit of a flippant remark, friends will tell you who work in this area, I've said, we need to understand more about consumers and fashion in terms of what goes on in people's heads. Because, I mean, there's certain things I can see from my own pathetic behavior and, you know, that of some friends. I can see where some of that stuff is coming from. But, you know, it wasn't always like this. It's hot. I hate that thing, when I was young. But when I was young, you know, we didn't have high street fashion in the same way that we have now. There wasn't a fashion shop on every other street. And so maybe there was a whole different attitude. And that was after a period of austerity because of the Second World War, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a different time. I'm not at all saying we should go back to that. What I am saying is that there are connections between the way we see ourselves and our identities and senses of belonging, et cetera, that have made us into easy prey isn't quite the right term, but have made us susceptible to certain kinds of marketing and so on. And I think we need to know more about that. So I don't know why.
Yeah, susceptible is a very good word for that, actually. And psychology of it all. I mean, it's a whole other topic altogether, isn't it?
Well, look at Rosanna. Look how easy it is to make women feel bad about their bodies, right? You know, it's the easiest thing in the world for some marketing company with some magical cure for cellulite or something. You know, it's crazy. You know, what is that about? But we kind of get the sense of, you know, our need to belong, not to feel outcast, not to be dissed for how we look, etc., etc. As I say, yeah, it's a big sort of psychological issue, I think.
Our next question, Margot Couchet asked, hi there, I'm watching from the Condé Nast College and writing an essay on the ethics behind unpaid internships within the fashion industry. I would love to know what Baroness Young thinks on this subject. Does she believe brands think they have a degree of exclusivity from exploiting young people, and should therefore and should there be a legality surrounding unpaid work here in the UK? We were actually discussing this just before this evening began. Yeah.
That's right, and you know, it is a big issue. You know, not that I would draw a sort of direct analogy with Parliament necessarily, but it's endemic. It has been endemic in Parliament because you get a profession where people want to get in. They're really desperately keen to be in politics or in fashion or in film or in theatre, whatever. And in order to get a bit of experience, to get that groundwork done, they will work for nothing if they come from a background which is able to support them to do that. So, you know, just on that level, if we return to the Russian dolls thing again, we've got a situation where people who come from less privileged backgrounds will simply not have the financial ability to go into those positions. And so what do you get? You get more of the same people all of the time. That is, those people who come from particularly privileged backgrounds. So how do you diversify the industry when you're saying, oh, well, basically you've got to be able to work for nothing for a year? And it happens in a lot of the creative industries. And that's because, as I say, these are desirable jobs. I think, I don't know how you would do it without legislation. I'm sure there's some kind of push-pull factors, some carrots and sticks we could use, but I don't think it ought to be possible to employ somebody to do a job of work for nothing.
And I really think, I mean, just think of the talent that all these creative industries are missing out on through perpetuating this model year after year after year. Okay, lots of questions. I'm going to pick another. Kay Carmichael would love to know whether Baroness Young thinks the responsibility lies to drive change with companies and corporates, the consumer, or the government through legislation. I know we've touched on this, but if you could kind of summarize it, that'd be great.
Sure. No, I'm glad this question is there because, you know, I did talk about individual responsibility before, but actually I think it's with corporates and with help or with, what is it, you know, punishment or pain or incentives from government. Because, as you know, I would always go back to you, the company, you, the business world, you've constructed your business models in such a way as your priority is not around people or planet, it's around financial profit, and that's got to change. So yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm moving on quite swiftly because I want to answer as many as possible. Yeah. But excellent answer. Natasha Duncan, hello, do you believe there could be any amendments made to the Modern Slavery Act of 2015? For example, according to the UK Parliament website, companies with a turnover of more than 36 million must publish an annual statement on transparency in its supply chains. This can include information on due diligence and policies. This applies to slavery, forced labour, human trafficking, but not underpayment. So yeah, whether there are any amends to the Act of 2015.
Well, I think the underpayment, if we're talking about in this country, you have to pay people the minimum wage. So we've got a set of laws and regulations that govern that. And indeed, there is a naming and shaming for people who pay, for organisations that pay less than the minimum wage. Whether we could get that up to the living wage is another issue. I don't know that it would be appropriate within that act, but I think it is covered in other legal instruments.
I see what you mean. That makes sense. Roberto Battistoni. Hi there, I'm passionate about transparency and sustainability in fashion. I strongly agree sustainability is about the environmental impact and the social impact. Do you think that new policies will be enforced in the UK as the UK prepares to host the first climate change conference this year?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question again, because I think the environmental movement has actually been very slow in thinking about the social side that isn't to do directly with environmental sustainability. So I'm going to be very interested to see what happens at COP, what is it, 2026, 21 or whatever. Well, the next COP, you know, the big conference thing, to see, because I've spoken to people and tried to get them to try and inject this sort of, thank you, Rachel, COP26. Yeah, I thought it was 26, and then I thought, no, it's 2021. Anyway, whatever. Yeah, I think it's quite difficult to get that in, just beginning to happen. And this goes back to our Russian dolls analogy, because also in that mix is sustainable development. You know, if we talk about the sustainable development goals alongside all the environmental sustainability, racism, modern slavery, all interconnected. If we could do something about those, we're winning. You know, we're really, really winning.
Yeah, it's about the interconnection of them all, and that's far too often forgotten. Right, one final one, and then we have a quick fire from Rachel. I've lost my place. Oh, I think this is the final one, yes. I am a student writing an essay regarding the recruitment process in the fashion industry. I would be interested to know what changes the Baroness believes could be made to the recruitment process to ensure that cases of modern slavery cases are not being implemented into the supply chain by big brands.
Recruitment process of what people into?
The recruitment process of new suppliers, perhaps.
Right, okay.
Yeah, Taylor's focusing on the supply chain of brands.
Yeah, okay. I don't have a quick answer to that one, because again, I feel that it comes down to what your priorities are in terms of your business. So if you want, you know, stuff that's done quick, down and dirty, then, you know, I'm sure you can find that. It's also about the extent to which you're prepared to do that research, to do that due diligence stuff, which is relatively, well, it's easier now than it was 20 years ago, obviously. Yeah. And clearly a fear is that during the pandemic, a lot of that has been able to slip and to slide down to, well, we don't know, because we can't get out there. You know, I was speaking to somebody the other day who's got factories in China. You can't go out and inspect them, you know, because there's all these issues about the oppression of the Uyghur peoples in China. So yeah, it's difficult.
So the element is really difficult. Okay, I've just seen we have two in chat. Rachel, if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to ask one more, and then I'm going to hand over to your quickfire. This is from Rawny Whitto Williams. There were copious plans being drafted and presented to government through the BRC on the opportunities of bringing back elements of manufacturing in the UK on the back of Brexit, and hopefully bring back a resurgence of dying skills. With the track record of UK manufacturing at Leicester, Manchester and London, how could this realistically be done ethically with a lack of funding and resources for government agencies like the GLAA?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and it's a question I keep asking those people, because I'm not against bringing at least some manufacturing back to this country. It'd be impossible to bring it all back if under the same kinds of business models that we currently have. So it's absolutely the case that bringing them back here would not necessarily improve working conditions to the extent that we might like. But it's also, there's a skills gap, because we'd have to have a really good comprehensive education and skills and training plan, particularly again post the pandemic, so that we got people with the actual skills that can do this and make that work attractive. I think what's happened with fashion is that if you ask people, yeah, I'd like to work in fashion, want to be a model or a designer or creative director or whatever, we need people who can cut patterns and make clothes, actually. And these skills, I think taking them out of the school curriculum is a big mistake. You know, you need those kinds of skills, and they're useful in all kinds of contexts. So yeah, it's a big question. It's not just as simple, and I think that question really points that out. It's not as simple as saying, yeah, bring it all back here and all our problems are solved.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. We've expanded the conversation even further, which I didn't think would be possible. Rachel, over to you, quick fire, let's go.
Yes, amazing. So Lola, as we said, little fun ending that we always do. Quite difficult to prepare this one, I must say, because
I'm terrified, actually.
No, well, it's quite a serious subject. I could hardly get you to choose between slavery and not slavery. So I've given it a fair whack. So we will see. Bit of fun. People or planet?
Oh,
so hard. I'm so sorry.
Oh, can you have one without the other? I can't conceive of one.
One solves the other.
Have I really got to choose? Oh,
no. That one was a really, really mean one to start.
That's a mean one. I would ask you that one.
Well, if we were to go with our Russian dolls, we would say people, wouldn't we? Because then that would help solve planet.
But that would help the planet. Yeah, the right.
So
people.
maybe the right people.
Yeah,
that's very true. I think you partly answered this in the Q&A section, actually, but individual actions or industry actions?
Industry action.
Regulation or self-motivation?
Well, I'd like to think it would be self-motivation, but let me be kind of positive and say self-motivation to start with.
Interesting. And again, this is another question that came up in our Q&A, which is brilliant. Our audience is so on it. Made in the UK or made overseas?
But these questions are just not fair.
I know, I'm really sorry. Normally they're really silly and quite fun. This one was very hard to write.
Yeah. I'm going to cheat and say made ethically and sustainably.
I'll let you have that. Okay, here's a fun one. Work from, and I actually can't take credit for it because Rosanna wrote this one. Work from home or work from the House of Lords?
From home.
Fantastic. 2021 or 2051?
Well, I won't be around in 2051, I can assure you.
You don't know that.
But I suppose for my son, and I hope that things will be better for his generation, 2051.
Amazing. I will end it there. Thank you.
Generation will be the people that make it better.
Indeed, I totally agree. Thank you for being such a good sport with that. That was great fun. And thank you from me sincerely for this incredible conversation. Thank you for saying yes and for being here this evening and bringing so much value to our FashMash community. We so appreciate it. And I will hand over to Rosanna.
Thank you. Can I just say quickly, thank you, because you're a great conversationalist and managed to tease out lots of really important things.
Oh, thank you.
The questions from the audience were great as well. I mean, sincerely, because they were getting to the nub of these things, and some of them I should honestly have said, you know what, I can't answer this right now. So thank you to everybody, and thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, no, thank you. Rosanna,
and thanks to Rosanna, of course. Yeah, for being the mediator.
I couldn't agree more with what Rachel said, and thank you for saying that about our community. We've really noticed that in the last year since we've been online. They put so much thought into the questions and research, I think, even ahead of joining in the evening. So thank you very much for saying that. I'm surprised you chose work from home. I think I would choose work from the House of Lords. I think that would be...
That's because it's not your workplace.
So
the dress code. There's the dress code. I can wear my jeans and trainers at home. I can't do that in the House of Lords. You see how superficial I am at heart. And it's like, yeah, I can have a cup of tea when I feel like it. I can go around the corner and see my son for lunch, and etc. And no traveling on public transport in the rush hour.
I think we can sigh of relief we're not doing that right now. Thank you both so much. Thank you for everyone who attended. Thank you once again to our sponsor Klaviyo, and just a final request that if you have not yet donated this evening to our brilliant charity, please do via Eventbrite. We will be sharing news of our March speaker and our April speaker very soon, so sign up for our, I nearly forgot the name for it. Sign up for our emailers if you have not yet done so on our website, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.